Karamir Muffet. Also taking part in this presentation is going to be Jordan Ingram, Andrew Hurd and Nick Mantle. Just to let you know, the presentation is going to be recorded and it's going to be shown on YouTube later on, so you can refer back to the meeting. If you've got any questions during the presentation, you can type them into the chat. If you do ask a question, please can I ask that you state your name and your local authority that you're from. Colleagues are going to be monitoring the chat to answer any questions as we go along, and we hope to have time at the end to answer any questions as well. But if we don't, we will follow up after the meeting and ensure that every question is answered. A copy of the slides is going to be sent round to colleagues after the presentation, so the links that we show you on the final page will be accessible when we send that round to you. Okay, so I'll pass you over to Jordan now for him to take you through the first few slides. Thank you, Jordan.
Morning, everyone. Thanks for that, Karamir. So just to open with a bit of background on the legislation that applies to disapplications, as you can see from the main screen there, local authorities can apply not to adhere to a requirement of the School and Early Years Finance England Regulations 2022 or the Dedicated Schools Grant Conditions of Grant when setting their schools' budgets. The regulations and the DSG grant details how the local authorities are able to distribute the DSG funding, such as the allowable funding formula factors, pass-through rates, and ring fencing between blocks. The regulations also cover what local authorities can retain for central expenditure, for example, statutory responsibilities that local authorities hold for all schools or maintain schools only, such as admissions and audits. So each year the department receives requests from local authorities to set aside some aspects of the funding regulations or the conditions of grant as specified on screen there. And this is done where the local authorities in question have identified that there is an unintended consequence due to a local situation. So the key message there is that disapplication requests should only be made for exceptional reasons, and where a disapplication request is made, there should always be a regulation to disapply alongside that disapplication. So moving on to more detail on disapplication requests and what we look for. Firstly, we'd like to know what is the impact of your request alongside any detail about alternative options that have been considered. So we look specifically for the impact on the school, the pupil, and the local authority. As part of that, we look at, as stated, what alternatives have been explored, and of the alternatives that have been explored, why haven't these been taken forward? We always look for supporting financial modelling, such as the up-to-date financial position of schools affected by the request in relation to level of reserves, and also local authorities' direct schools grant position. We look at what, if any, transitional steps or mitigants have been considered and agreed. And if your request is likely to result in a reduction in funding, we'd like you to please explain what steps you have taken to ensure that there won't be any detriment to pupil outcomes or the provision of education more widely. It's always useful for us to see the wider context of the request. So if you're able to explain as part of it how you've considered local factors before you submit the request and how the request aligns with both the local authority and the DfE's future strategic approach to education provision, for example, in relation to Ofsted improvement or any DSG recovery plans that you have in place. Consultation is very important. So what are the views of the impacted schools, any parent carer groups, schools forum, or any other interested parties? So as part of any request, we ask you to please always include a copy of the schools forum minutes. And this is so that we can see when the meeting happened, what the forum voted on, and what the outcome of that vote was. And if any other consultations have taken place with any affected parties, then it's always useful if you can summarise those as well. To give a brief overview of the process that we take part in when we receive a disapplication, the request is received into our disapplications inbox, followed by a review of the supporting evidence. For example, is the equalities impact assessment included? We may come back and ask for additional information if we have any questions on the supporting information that has been submitted. Once this has been done, we then undergo internal discussions where we ask other DfE teams for comments or feedback on your request. And once that's taken place, we then draft a submission and advice is put up to the Secretary of State to make a decision. As part of any submission to the Secretary of State, the aim is that your request has a coherent narrative that we can put up to the Secretary of State, and it's very important that you don't assume the Secretary of State knows what is happening in your local authority. So a summary of key facts is needed to ensure a fair, reasonable and consistent decision is made. Once we hear back, we then communicate that decision, including any conditions of the decision to you. And just to provide a bit more background on the considerations that we make, we like to know why this request is the local authority's preferred option and why is it considered to result in the best possible outcomes for schools, pupil and the local authority in the short and long term. And acting upon feedback we have received and support you with your requests that you make, we have updated the Disapplication Performer this year to include a best practice tab, which details a bit more about the supporting information we expect for general and high needs requests. So if you've got any feedback on that, please do let us know. On screen now is just a list of some of the common types of requests that we receive each year, which can include minimum funding guarantee, minimum per pupil level, disapplications to vary pupil numbers, sparsity, lump sum, etc. So I'll just leave those on screen for a few seconds for you to look at, but as Karamia has said, these slides will be distributed for you to look at again after the presentation. As part of the general disapplications review and lessons learned over the last year, during the summer we've done some work to scrutinise local authorities' use of the exceptional factors criteria in particular as we move closer towards the direct national funding formula. And what we've done as part of that work, we've established which local authorities currently meet the exceptional factors criteria and which do not. And we've begun to challenge those who appear not to meet the criteria and requesting a new disapplication. We've also done this where it looks like the local authority's use of the factor has expired and is due for renewal, whether or not they meet the criteria. So for any new requests that we receive on this basis in 23 to 24, it's useful to see agreements as evidence of the exceptional costs, particularly where this is in relation to joint use or unavoidable rental costs. This is also a good point to remind everyone that the latest consultation on the national funding formula details proposals for what is likely to be agreed in future under this criteria, and that's going to become a more limited list of accepted circumstances. I believe that consultation is still open or it has just closed, but I believe it is still available to view online. So that's just for a bit of background information. I'm now going to hand over to Andrew to present you on high needs.
Thank you very much, Jordan. So I'm going to focus on one type of high needs disapplication request, and that is the Special Schools Minimum Funding Guarantee. This has been set at 3% over 2 years for 2023 to 24. And top-up funding must be set at a rate to ensure a school's total, so that's place and top-up, budget is set at 3% higher per pupil than 2021 to 22. Examples can be found in Annex 1 of the High Needs Operational Guide, including the template of how we would like the financial modelling to be set out, which should form part of the supporting information for your disapplication request. As Jordan mentioned, we have acted upon feedback and that we've received, and to support you with your request, we've included a Special Schools Minimum Funding Guarantee section on the Best Practice tab of the Disapplication Performer. We've also updated the Special School MFG section, so that's Annex 1 of the High Needs Funding Operational Guide. So section 16.1 of Annex 1 and the supporting information section of the pro forma outlines the information we would like as part of your request. So we would like to know how the impact has been considered on specialist education being provided to pupils by the schools that are not meeting the MFG, why the request is the local authority's preferred option, what alternatives have been considered and why these were discounted, so an options appraisal, Any transitional arrangements that the local authority is putting in place to minimise the impact on special schools and to provide assurance of their ongoing viability. Relevant contextual information, such as the results of recent Ofsted inspections, financial modelling and the modelling for the preferred option should be in line with the examples that we've included in Annex 1, and these should show the financial impact on those schools not meeting the MFG. Information about any previous changes in funding that have been approved by the Secretary of State and or agreed with the schools affected. Any information on funding changes in 2022 to 23. Information on the affected schools' financial health, so reserves, deficits, and also an analysis of the in-year balances over previous years. This should all come from published data on gov.uk. And details of the local authority's DSG balanced, again, as evidence from published data, and the forecast balance at the end of the financial year for 2022 to 23. Also, if the local authority has a DSG deficit, we'd like you to provide a copy of an up-to-date recovery plan and explain how the disapplication of the MFG links to this plan. So, key message. The disapplication request and supporting information is your business case as to why the Secretary of State should agree to a local authority not passing on increased funding to a school. Your business case should be compelling as the bar for approval is high. As with any business case, we suggest that you take a step back before submitting it and ask yourself, if this was being presented to you, would you agree it? What questions would you ask? Has it been considered as part of the bigger picture within the local authority? And is the supporting information you're planning to include relevant? So, 2 final points from me. Local authorities that have a safety valve agreement with the department should make their disapplication request using the safety valve team email. And for other local authorities, we would ask that if you're planning to submit a high needs disapplication request, to get in touch with us for an initial discussion before starting the process. Both of those email addresses can be found on the final slide of this presentation and also in Annex 1 of the High Needs Funding Operational Guide. I'm now going to hand back to Karamia to talk about block movement disapplication requests.
Oh, thank you, Andrew. Okay, so just to run you through the block movement requests then, as you can see from the slide on the screen, the schools block will again, like previous years, be partially ring fenced in 23-24. This basically means that you can transfer up to 0.5% of your schools block funding over into another block, but that must have the approval of your schools forum. It's also important to remember that whilst we have a new minister, in the past, ministers have consistently been reluctant to agree requests which haven't received schools forum approval. We have no reason to believe that this minister is going to be any different. Could I have the next slide, please, Jordan? Thank you. So the first thing that we look at is the supporting information sent to us alongside the disapplication requests. Most requests currently are to move money out of the schools block and over into the high needs block. So the guidance on the .gov.uk website details all the information that we need to see for us to be able to fully consider the requests, as we've already discussed in an earlier slide. But for block movements, there's some additional specific requirements that we have. We have a management plan template, which I'm sure you're all aware of and you've all seen. You can use that template, and if it's fully completed, it could be used to show the majority of the financial information that we need for block movement requests. If you use the form or not, though, we also need to see the following. I'll just run through the list of what we need to see. So information around any previous block movements, and that includes those that didn't require a disapplication request. Details around the pressures the movement of previous blocks of money were designed to address. A full breakdown of specific budget pressures justifying the transfer of money, and that includes changes in demand for special provision, over the last 3 years, and how the local authority has met that demand by commissioning places in all sectors. All this information should be quantified where possible. We also need an assessment of why the high needs costs are exceeding funding levels and the plans to change the pattern of provisions where it's necessary to do so. We need an assessment of the need to seek schools forum approval for further transfers in future and consideration of plans to avoid this if possible. We need detailed explanations for the requirement of the transfer for the high needs block. We need details around the partnership between the local authority, those institutions offering special and alternative provisions, and that also includes mainstream schools and parents, and between the local authority and neighbouring authorities. We need to know about if there's any contributions coming from the health and social care budgets towards the cost of more complex specialist places. We also need to know what has been considered when it comes to how additional high needs funding would be targeted to good and outstanding mainstream schools that provide excellent education for a larger than average number of pupils with high needs, or to support the inclusion of children with SEND in mainstream schools. And we also need details of the effect that any transfer would have on individual schools' budget funded from the schools block. And we also need to see the information that you present to Schools Forum and to all the schools through the consultation and details of the responses to the proposed transfer of funds. So when we looked at our overview of the process, once we've received this information from the local authority, we then hold a number of internal meetings with colleagues where we discuss the information that you've provided provided to us, should I say. So looking at what considerations then that we make, each request is considered on a case by case basis, but the department has certain criteria that we have to look for at determining whether the local authority has a strong case for a block movement. So the things that we look for, and again, this is in the guidance, it's strong evidence that a further transfer remains necessary to address significant cost pressures. Specific and detailed plans which demonstrates the transferred funding would contribute to addressing cost pressures in a sustainable way, such as invest to save options. We need to see strong evidence of a marked and recent transfer of financial responsibility for children with high needs from the schools block to the high needs block. So, for an example, through a significant increase in permanent exclusions requiring the local authority to make more alternative provision, or maybe there's been a significant increase in the proportion of children with the HCPs which have been placed in the specialist settings rather than mainstream schools. We need to see a strong SEND sufficiency plan outlining the actions that your local authority will take to ensure a sustainable sector, along with how the transfer will impact this work. And we also look for a good level of support for the transfer of funds from the local schools and the schools forum. And this includes seeing a breakdown of local consultations. When we've received all this information, we'll then use it to provide a summary to the minister. So when drafting the summary, we have to include information around why the high needs costs are exceeding funding levels. And we also have to provide a detail of short, medium and longer term strategies, including the financial data that the local authority has planned. And just to highlight how important it is to provide the necessary information for the disapplication request at the start of the process. Notoriously, we're often hanging back for evidence that Schools Forum has voted for or against the request because the Schools Forum meetings are arranged after the closing date for block movement disapplications. But without this information, we're not able to put your disapplication request up to the minister. That can then result in delays getting decisions back, and that has a knock-on effect for you, as you might then be asked to provide two APTs, one as if the disapplication request has been approved and the other as if the disapplication has not been approved. So that's really why it's important to get all the information to us at the start of the process. So that's block movement requests. I'm now going to pass you over to Nick, who'll take you through early years disapplications. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Karamia. So on this slide that's on the screen now, I'm not going to spend an awful lot of time talking through it, mainly because a lot of what's important on this slide has already been covered by my colleagues on their discussions of the disapplication process already, and a lot of it is very much appropriate and applicable to early years as well. So in very sort of short summary mode, what I would simply say is just those key messages again that have already been discussed in the presentation already, which is around specifically for early years disapplications, just with your rationale being clear and setting out all the possible considerations you've made, not just the disapplication request, but any alternative considerations, setting out why those considerations have been discounted and you've opted to go for the disapplication route instead, and crucially demonstrating to us what the implications would be of us approving the disapplication and also what the implications could be if the disapplication request was refused. The process is again the same. You'll submit the disapplication pro forma to ourselves. We'll consider it in line with colleagues, obviously in this case, particularly our early years policy colleagues, and we'll obviously seek the decision from the Secretary of State as quickly as we can and communicate that to you accordingly. The only things I would signpost are that on the pro forma tool there is a best practice tab on there, which we would certainly recommend that you do review when completing your disapplication pro forma. That will guide you a little bit in the completion of the document itself. If you are able to give us any early notification that a disapplication is coming our way, that's always helpful. I appreciate that's not always possible in certain circumstances, but if you are able to let us know ahead of time that you intend to submit a disapplication, that is, as I say, helpful just in terms of assuring that we can have resource in place ready to action it as quickly as possible rather than reacting to it when it drops in accordingly. If you want to move on to the next slide, Jordan. So just to talk a little bit further about early years, more specifically, the most common type of early years request we do get is to adjust the pass-through rate. The minimum requirement is 95%, but many local authorities, if they submit an early years disapplication, it's normally most commonly because they want to adjust that pass-through rate and reduce it slightly. That first bullet point does cover off a couple of other examples of types of early years disapplication, but as you can see, we didn't receive that many last year, and the majority that we did receive were in relation to the pass-through rate. Just to mention that when you complete the early years pro forma tabs on the disapplication, you'll obviously have an option on there to select what the circumstances are for submitting the disapplication request, whether it is to adjust the pass-through rate or whether it's to include central spend additional factors and so on. Once you select your option, it will then automatically populate with which particular section of the regulations you're looking to disapply. So if you are keen to read the actual legislative guidance that sits behind that and see exactly what is being disapplied, it does reference that in the pro forma tab for you accordingly. The final point we would make on early years disapplications would just be in relation to the calculation modelling. So on the pro forma, there is a tab where you set out the modelling of obviously of what the funding looks like before the disapplication is applied and shows what the calculations will be. If, for example, the early years pass-through rate isn't adjusted, and then it will also allow you to demonstrate what the revised funding would look like if we did approve a pass-through request. What we would ask is that when you're doing that calculation modelling, if you're intending to transfer in any funds from other blocks, so for example, if you're looking to move funding from your high needs block into the early years block, if you can make sure that's factored in as part of your calculation before you apply the adjustment to your pass-through. We have had it sometimes in previous years where local authorities have moved funding from one block into the early years block, but they haven't necessarily factored that in as part of their pass-through adjustment calculation. So it's just to make that point, if you are intending to do that action, make sure that's factored in before you then start doing the calculation modelling accordingly to help demonstrate that the pass-through request is still relevant to be adjusted. That's it for myself, Jordan, if you want to move on from there.
Thanks very much, Nick. So I'll now be doing a brief overview of the pro forma as we've made some changes this year. So as we mentioned earlier, we've added a best practice tab, and that is what supporting information we would like to see for disapplication requests. Next slide, please. We then have the general and high needs request tab. We've updated the format this year, so it's more user-friendly. We've decluttered it and ensured that it also mirrors the best practice tab. Next slide. Got the block movements request tab there. Next, please. And we've got the early years pass-through pro forma. Next. And we also have the PSED guidance tab. So that includes links to the relevant guidance. And finally, we have the Recording Equalities Impacts tab. Next slide. So I'm just going to talk a bit more about the Equalities Impact Assessment. So part of the DFE's mission is equality of opportunity. So all disapplication requests require an Equalities Impact Assessment as part of the supporting information. So we are content with an overarching principle. For example, children and young people with similar levels of need will receive similar levels of funding. However, the assessment should also give consideration to all of the protected characteristics, such as age, sex, and race. So this is irrespective of whether these are relevant to the request or not. Consideration should also be given to how your proposals eliminate discrimination, harassment, or victimisation of any persons with a protected characteristic. Proposals should also advance equality of opportunity between persons who share a relevant protected characteristic and those who do not. So the key question here is, how does your request impact or not any particular group with protected characteristics? This needs to be demonstrated as part of your supporting information. So I'm now going to hand back to Nick.
Thanks, Andrew. So just some key dates for your diary here. Obviously, as with previous years, we've set deadlines for our disapplication requests. So just to firstly emphasise our 10th of October 22 deadline, and that's the deadline for submitting all general requests, and adhering to that deadline means you will get a response by December from ourselves on the disapplication. The 18th of November 22 deadline is the deadline for submitting all general requests to ensure you get a response by the APT deadline. It's also the deadline for all schools block movements which are above the 0.5% threshold, which Karamia referenced earlier, or also for any requests whereby schools forum have been consulted but have not agreed or approved with this application that the local authority is submitting. We would stress that if you are intending to discuss this application request at a schools forum, but that hasn't taken place yet, you are still able to submit the pro forma in advance of that schools forum taking place. Obviously, as you would expect, there won't be any sort of decision made on this application in the absence of any schools forum discussion having taken place, but you can indicate that on the pro forma and make it clear that the schools forum is in the diary and is going to take place shortly. And what that enables us to do is still take into consideration the initial information you provided on the disapplication. We can begin formulating our thinking. And then, as I say, if you notify us later on, once the schools forum meeting has taken place, you can let us know what the outcome of any discussion was on the disapplication, and we can then proceed from there to start looking at what advice we put up to the Secretary of State for consideration. The 13th of January deadline is just for any amendments that you wish to make to any block movement requests that you've already submitted. So examples of that might be if the demands for high needs provision have changed significantly or unexpectedly, or perhaps if final pupil numbers from the October census are significantly different from those you expected previously. The only other piece of information to mention that's not included on this slide is just in respect to special schools minimum funding guarantee requests, which can be put in later. We would still expect them to be put in no later than January because of the potential impact on local authorities' high needs budget setting for 23-24. But it's just to emphasise that point because, as I say, it's not referenced there on the slide in front of you. If you could just move on to the next slide, Jordan. So a couple of key thoughts just to leave you with, and again, a lot of this is just summarising the points we've made throughout the presentation already, which is, in terms of assessing your disapplication request, to always try and put yourself in the position of the audience that's receiving it and assessing it from their point of view. So, as I say, take into consideration the arguments that you formed in the disapplication request and make sure that from the point of view of the person receiving it, that it covers off any potential questions that they might have had, and that you feel confident there's enough information in there to put up to the Secretary of State to make an informed decision. And again, also consider it from the perspective of the Secretary of State in terms of, would they agree to a reduction of school funding based on the rationale you've provided within this application request itself?
So that's just some useful links up there that we were talking about earlier, and you will be able to access these as and when you view the presentation that's sent round afterwards. So I think all that's left to say there is to thank everyone for coming to the presentation. Obviously, if you have got any further questions, then you can email the Disapplications inbox and one of us will pick that up and get back to you in due course. So thanks to everyone for your time today, and we look forward to receiving your Disapplications. Thank you.